The wind screamed like a banshee, tearing through the trees and hurling snow against the windows of the small cabin. Inside, Elias Thorne sat by the fire, a book in his hands, though he hadn't turned a page in over an hour. The storm had been raging for days, and the isolation was beginning to wear on him. The cabin, nestled deep in the northern wilderness, was his refuge from the world, a place where he could forget the mistakes of his past. But tonight, the storm felt different. It felt alive. A sudden noise cut through the wind, a scratching at the door. Elias froze, his heart pounding. No one should be out there. No one could be out there in this weather. He set the book down and grabbed the iron poker from the hearth, his knuckles white as he approached the door. The scratching came again, more urgent this time. Elias hesitated, then pulled the door open, bracing himself against the cold. What he saw made him stumble back. A wolf stood on his doorstep, its fur matted with ice and snow. Its golden eyes locked onto his, and for a moment Elias felt as though the creature was looking straight into his soul. Behind it, more wolves emerged from the storm, their forms barely visible in the swirling snow. They were silent, their heads lowered, their breath steaming in the frigid air. The lead wolf, a massive alpha with a scar running down its muzzle, stepped forward and let out a soft, almost pitiful whine. It was a sound Elias had never heard from a wolf before. It wasn't a growl or a snarl. It was a plea. Elias glanced back at the fire, then at the wolves. His mind raced. Wolves were predators, dangerous and unpredictable. But these creatures didn't look like they were here to attack. They looked desperate. "Fine," he muttered, stepping aside. "But if you try anything, I'll—" The wolves filed past him, their movements slow and deliberate. They didn't snarl or snap. They simply padded into the cabin, their paws leaving wet prints on the wooden floor. Elias shut the door behind them, his heart still racing. He watched as the wolves settled around the fire, their bodies steaming as the ice melted from their fur. But something was wrong. Elias frowned, his grip tightening on the poker. The wolves' shadows danced on the walls, but they didn't move like they should. They twisted and writhed, as if alive. And their eyes glowed faintly, a pale, unnatural light that made his skin crawl. The alpha wolf turned its head, its gaze falling on the old chest in the corner of the room. Elias followed its gaze, his stomach tightening. The chest had been there when he bought the cabin, its contents a mystery. He'd never been able to open it, no matter how hard he tried. The storm outside grew louder, the wind howling like a chorus of voices. Elias felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. He had the sinking feeling that he'd just made a terrible mistake. The wolves lay motionless around the fire, their breathing slow and steady. Elias kept his distance, the poker still in his hand. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The way the wolves moved, the way their shadows twisted on the walls, it wasn't natural. The alpha wolf's eyes remained fixed on the chest, its gaze unwavering. Elias glanced at the chest, then back at the wolf. "What do you want with that?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The wolf didn't respond, of course, but Elias could have sworn it understood him. Its ears twitched, and it let out a low, rumbling growl that sent a shiver down his spine. Elias took a step toward the chest, his curiosity getting the better of him. He'd tried to open it countless times before, but the lock had always held firm. Now, with the wolves watching him, he felt a strange compulsion to try again. He knelt in front of the chest, running his fingers over the intricate carvings on its surface. They were symbols he didn't recognize, ancient and otherworldly. The lock was cold to the touch, its metal tarnished with age. Elias pulled at it, but it didn't budge. The alpha wolf let out another growl, this time louder. Elias turned to look at it, and his blood ran cold. The wolf's shadow had grown larger, stretching across the wall until it loomed over him like a specter. Its eyes glowed brighter, and its lips pulled back in a silent snarl. Elias scrambled to his feet, backing away from the chest. "What the hell are you?" he demanded, his voice trembling. The wolf didn't move, but its shadow did. It shifted and writhed, forming shapes that made no sense. Twisted figures with too many limbs, eyes that blinked and stared, mouths that opened in silent screams. Elias felt a wave of dizziness, his vision blurring as the shadows closed in around him. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the shadows retreated. The wolves were still lying by the fire, their eyes closed as if nothing had happened. Elias leaned against the wall, his chest heaving. He looked at the chest, then at the wolves, and knew one thing for certain. He was in over his head. That night Elias dreamed. He stood in a frozen forest, the trees skeletal and black against the pale sky. The air was thick with the scent of pine and something else, something metallic like blood. The wolves were there, their forms flickering like shadows. They moved through the trees, their eyes glowing like embers. The alpha wolf led the pack, its scarred muzzle lifted as if scenting the air. It turned to look at Elias, and he felt a jolt of recognition. The wolf wasn't just an animal, it was something more, something ancient. The dream shifted, and Elias found himself standing in front of the chest. The lock was gone, the lid slightly ajar. A cold wind blew from within, carrying with it a whisper that made his skin crawl. "Open it." Elias reached for the lid, his fingers trembling. As he lifted it, a blinding light erupted from the chest, and he woke with a start. He was in his bed, the fire reduced to embers. The wolves were gone, the cabin silent except for the sound of the wind outside. Elias sat up, his heart pounding. It had been a dream, just a dream, but when he looked at the chest, he saw that the lock was broken. Elias stared at the chest, his breath visible in the cold morning air. The lock, which had resisted his efforts for years, now hung broken, the metal twisted as if by some immense force. He hadn't touched it since the wolves left, or since he woke from that strange dream. Yet here it was, open. He approached the chest cautiously, his mind racing. The wolves were gone, but their presence lingered in the cabin. The air felt heavier, charged with an energy he couldn't explain. The fire had died down, leaving the room cold and dim. Outside, the storm had passed, leaving the world blanketed in silence and snow. Elias knelt in front of the chest, his fingers brushing against the lid. The carvings seemed to shift under his touch, the symbols twisting and writhing like the shadows of the wolves. He hesitated, then lifted the lid. Inside, the chest was filled with strange objects. A tarnished silver mirror, its surface cracked and clouded. A bundle of yellowed papers tied with a frayed ribbon. A small, intricately carved wooden box, and a dagger with a blade that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. At the bottom of the chest lay a large, leather-bound book, its cover embossed with the same symbols as the chest itself. Elias reached for the book, his fingers trembling. As he lifted it, a chill ran through him as if the book itself were alive. He opened it to the first page, and his breath caught in his throat. The page was filled with handwritten text, the ink faded but still legible. The words were in a language he didn't recognize, but the symbols matched those on the chest. Beneath the text was a drawing, a wolf, its eyes glowing, surrounded by twisting shadows. Elias flipped through the pages, his unease growing. The book was filled with more drawings, wolves, forests, strange rituals, and symbols that seemed to pulse on the page. There were notes scribbled in the margins, some in the same unfamiliar language, others in English. One phrase stood out, written in bold, frantic strokes: "They are not what they seem. The wolves are guardians. The shadows are the key." Elias closed the book, his mind reeling. Guardians? Shadows? What did it all mean? And why had the wolves brought him to this? He set the book aside and picked up the dagger. The blade was cold, its edge unnaturally sharp. As he turned it in his hands, he noticed something etched into the hilt, a single word in the same ancient language as the book. He didn't know how he knew, but he was certain of its meaning. Frost. Elias stood at the edge of the forest, the wolves at his side. The satchel on his shoulder felt heavier than it should, weighed down not just by the dagger, key, and book, but by the burden of the unknown. The wolves' golden eyes glowed faintly in the dim light, their breath steaming in the frigid air. They were waiting for him, their loyalty unwavering. The forest ahead was a labyrinth of shadows and snow. The trees loomed like ancient sentinels, their branches twisted and gnarled, their bark blackened by time and frost. The air was thick with the scent of pine and something else, something metallic like blood. Elias shivered, pulling his coat tighter around him. "All right," he muttered, more to himself than to the wolves. "Let's get this over with." The wolves moved as one, their movements fluid and silent. Elias followed, his boots crunching in the snow. The forest seemed to close in around him, the shadows deepening with every step. He could feel eyes on him, though he saw nothing. The wolves' ears twitched, their heads turning as if listening to something he couldn't hear. Hours passed, or maybe it was minutes. Time seemed to stretch and warp in the forest. The wolves led him to a clearing where a circle of stones stood, each one taller than a man and covered in the same strange symbols as the chest. The air here was charged with energy, the snow untouched, as if no living creature had ever stepped here. At the center of the circle was a small indentation, about the size of the silver key. Elias knelt in the snow, his fingers trembling as he pulled the key from his satchel. He hesitated, glancing at the wolves. The alpha wolf, Fenrir, met his gaze, its golden eyes steady and reassuring. Elias placed the key into the indentation, and the air around him seemed to hum with energy. The symbols on the stones began to glow, a pale, icy light that spread through the clearing. The wolves' shadows twisted and writhed, their forms flickering like flames. And then the vision came. Elias was no longer in the clearing. He stood on the edge of a vast, frozen lake, the ice stretching as far as the eye could see. The sky above was a swirling mass of black and silver, the air thick with the scent of snow and something ancient. In the distance, a figure stood, a woman, her hair white as snow, her eyes glowing like the wolves'. She raised a hand, beckoning him forward. "Come," her voice echoed in his mind. "You are the key." The vision ended as suddenly as it had begun. Elias was back in the clearing, the key still in his hand. The wolves were silent, their eyes fixed on him. "The lake," Elias said, his voice barely above a whisper. "We have to find the lake." The journey to the lake was long and arduous. The forest grew darker, the trees more twisted, the shadows deeper. The wolves moved with purpose, their golden eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. Elias followed, his breath steaming in the cold air. Finally, they emerged from the trees onto a rocky plateau. Before them stretched a vast, frozen lake, its surface smooth and unbroken, reflecting the pale light of the winter sun. At the far edge of the lake stood a small cabin, its roof heavy with snow. Smoke curled from the chimney, a sign of life in the otherwise desolate landscape. The wolves stopped at the edge of the lake, their heads lowered. Elias felt a surge of unease. Whoever lived here was connected to the wolves, to the chest, to everything that had happened. He took a deep breath and began to walk across the frozen lake, the wolves following silently behind him. As he approached the cabin, the door creaked open and a figure stepped out. It was the woman from his vision. She was tall and slender, her hair long and white, her skin pale as snow. Her eyes glowed with the same golden light as the wolves, and she wore a dress made of fur and leather adorned with bones and feathers. She looked ancient yet ageless, her presence both mesmerizing and terrifying. "Elias Thorne," she said, her voice low and melodic. "I've been waiting for you." Elias stopped in his tracks, his heart pounding. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The woman smiled, a cold, enigmatic smile. "I am Eleanor," she said. the last of the Frost Weavers, and you, Elias, are the key to breaking the curse. She led him into the cabin, the wolves following close behind. The interior was warm and cozy, a stark contrast to the frozen landscape outside. A fire crackled in the hearth and the air was filled with the scent of herbs and wood smoke. Eleanor sat at a rough-hewn table, her golden eyes studying him intently. "The wolves are not what they seem," she began, her voice soft but commanding. "They are guardians bound to the shadows by an ancient curse. Long ago, my ancestors made a pact with the spirits of the forest, a pact that granted them great power. But power always comes at a price." Elias leaned forward, his curiosity outweighing his fear. "What kind of price?" Eleanor's expression darkened. "The spirits demanded a sacrifice, a bond between human and wolf, a bond that would last for eternity. But the bond was corrupted, twisted by greed and ambition. The wolves became shadows, their souls trapped between worlds, and the Frost Weavers, my people, were cursed to wander the frozen wastes, forever bound to the wolves." Elias's mind raced as he processed her words. "And the chest? The key? What do they have to do with this?" Eleanor's gaze fell to the satchel at Elias's side. "The chest contains the remnants of the pact, the tools used to bind the wolves and the shadows. The key is the only way to break the curse. But to do so, you must face the shadows and the spirits that control them. It is a dangerous path, Elias, one that few have survived." Elias felt a chill run through him. "Why me? Why am I the key?" Eleanor's eyes softened, and for a moment she looked almost sad. "Because you are the last descendant of the Frost Weavers, Elias. The blood of my people runs through your veins. Only you can undo what was done." Elias stared at her, his mind reeling. He had always felt out of place in the world, as if he didn't belong. Now he knew why. "What do I have to do?" he asked, his voice steady despite the fear in his heart. Eleanor leaned forward, her eyes burning with intensity. "You must journey to the heart of the forest, to the place where the pact was made. There you will face the shadows and the spirits, and you must choose to break the curse or to become one of them." The heart of the forest was a place of darkness and despair. The trees were blackened and twisted, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. The air was thick with the scent of decay, the ground littered with bones and ash. Elias stood at the edge of the clearing, the wolves at his side. The stone altar loomed before him, its surface covered in the same ancient symbols as the chest. The air hummed with energy, the shadows swirling around him like a living thing. Elias took a deep breath and stepped into the clearing. The wolves followed, their golden eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. He could feel their presence in his mind, their thoughts and emotions blending with his own. They were ready, so was he. He placed the key on the altar, then drew the dagger and held it over the symbol carved into the stone. The shadows around him grew darker, more agitated, but the wolves stood their ground, their growls low and menacing. Elias began to chant the words from the book, his voice trembling at first but growing stronger with each word. The air around him seemed to hum with energy, and the shadows began to swirl, forming a vortex around the altar. As he chanted, the ground beneath him began to shake, and the altar itself seemed to come alive, its surface glowing with an eerie light. The shadows closed in, their forms taking on a more solid, menacing shape. Elias could feel their cold, empty gaze on him, but he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. Fenrir stepped forward, his golden eyes glowing brighter than ever. He let out a piercing howl, and the other wolves joined in, their voices blending into a single, powerful note. The shadows hesitated, their forms flickering, and Elias felt a surge of hope. He raised the dagger and plunged it into the symbol on the altar. The moment the blade touched the stone, a blinding light erupted from the altar, and the shadows let out a deafening scream. The ground shook violently, and Elias was thrown backward, the dagger still clutched in his hand. When the light faded, the shadows were gone. The altar stood silent and still, its surface no longer glowing. The air felt lighter, cleaner, as if a great weight had been lifted. Elias lay on the ground, his chest heaving, his mind reeling. He had done it. He had broken the curse. Elias stood at the edge of the forest, the wolves at his side. The bond he shared with them was stronger than ever. He could feel their thoughts, their emotions as clearly as his own. It was a strange, overwhelming sensation, but also comforting. He was no longer alone. The forest felt different now, alive in a way it hadn't been before. The trees seemed to hum with energy, and the shadows no longer felt threatening. They were a part of him, just as the wolves were. Elias knew his journey wasn't over. The bond was eternal, and with it came a responsibility to protect the balance of the forest, to guard against the darkness that still lurked at the edges of the world. But for the first time in his life, he felt like he had a purpose. He was no longer just Elias Thorne, the man who had run from his past. He was the new guardian, the last of the Frost Eaters, and he was ready to face whatever came next.